What are some of the biggest myths, misconceptions, and lies about gender today? Can we actually define what it means to be a man or a woman? Our guest today, I've been looking forward to having her on for a long time. Her name is Abigail Favale, and she's written a book that I will consider one of the best of its kind called The Genesis of Gender. Abigail, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, happy to be here.
We're going to jump into some specific issues, but your story is fascinating. Can you tell us how your worldview shifted from evangelical Christian to postmodern feminist and then back to the Catholic Church?
Yes. Yeah, it's kind of a weird story. Yeah, so like you mentioned, I was raised an evangelical Christian and I grew up in the Western United States and went to college at an evangelical school. And during college, I became super interested in feminism. I had a lot of questions about women's roles and my calling as a woman. And I had this longing to better understand my dignity as a woman. And so I first encountered feminist theology and philosophy and then just kind of cannonballed into the deep end. And then I went on into graduate school and studied gender theory and feminist literary criticism. And in that time, I really do think that feminism became my religion. I adopted a very, for lack of a better term, postmodern worldview. And then, to make a very weird story very short, around the time that I was turning 30, I had a very unexpected and tumultuous reversion back to the Christian
Hmm.
faith in the Catholic tradition. And that was the impetus for that, honestly, was becoming a mother for the first time.
Wow.
And that I began to ask questions that I hadn't asked in a long time. Um, and that process of questioning and seeking truth beyond the kind of narrow bubble of the ideology that I had embraced eventually landed me back in the church.
Mhm. I've got a ton of questions for you about that, but I know you've written a whole book really just talking about your story. So maybe we'll have you back and unpack that. But right now, I really want to get into your book again, The Genesis of Gender, which I recommend as highly as I can, a book on this program. And you talk about, to frame it, what you call the gender paradigm. What do you mean by that?
Sure. So the word paradigm, the way I'm using it, it basically means a framework for interpreting reality. So you kind of
Hmm.
enter into this framework, and then it's through that lens that you make sense of what's real and what's true. So what I describe as the gender paradigm is basically a paradigm that's developed over about the last 70 years or so. And it has a particular vision of the human person,
Hmm.
of God, of freedom, of language, of the body. And so much of the book is tracing the development of that paradigm. So, in brief, I would describe the gender paradigm as a worldview in which human beings are the creators. So, we are the ones who create
Hmm.
meaning, we are the ones who create truth. So, what we often think of as knowledge or truth are really just social constructs, and the body itself doesn't come with its own meaning, but is more of a project through which we can make meaning and project our identity into the world. And freedom is seen as transgression, kind of pushing past limits, blurring
Hmm.
boundaries. So, in many ways, in the gender paradigm, the human being takes the role of God in the Christian paradigm. So, in the Christian paradigm, God creates and we are creatures. In the gender paradigm, we do the creating, we aren't
Hmm.
creatures. And in the Christian paradigm, God creates through language. So, God's divine speech does
Hmm.
make reality, right? But in the gender paradigm, it's human speech that makes reality. So, those are just some of the contrasts there. And then in the gender paradigm, sexual difference is seen as a construct, as something that's not real,
Hmm.
but rather a category that's created by human beings. Whereas in the Genesis paradigm, sexual difference is part of God's self revelation, it's part of his own disclosure. And not only is it real in this kind of natural or biological sense, but it also has deep spiritual meaning.
I think what I resonate most with your book is that I think in terms of worldview and paradigm. And as I've been following, not 70 years back, don't have the training in this that you do, but have kind of been studying the larger LGBTQ conversation and really the past 4 to 5 years, the larger gender phenomena, have started to realize that there are differing worldviews about creation, what it means to be human, what's gone wrong with the world, and how we fix it. So, as I see it, it's not like Christians can just adopt some of the gender paradigm within Christianity. These are fundamentally different ways of looking at the world in terms of what it means to be human, the nature of our bodies, what's broken in the world, how we fix it. So, I'm guessing from reading your book and talking, that's how you see it too, that these are really in conflict at a deep paradigm worldview level, aren't they? Christianity, that is, and the gender paradigm.
Yes, I would say that's true in general, although I might nuance it a bit that there are
Okay.
certain claims that thinkers from within the gender paradigm might make, and that those claims might be true in a sense that could be incorporated into a Christian paradigm. So let me just give an example.
Yeah.
So one of the key claims in many of the theorists in the gender paradigm is that like that reality is socially and linguistically constructed. Now, I think there's some truth to that, right? So there are
Mm,
so many examples we can point to in history and also our present moment where language is used to create a certain perception. It's used to shape our perceptions of reality. And so language has a lot of power about how we see the world. So any totalitarian regime you can point to uses language in a way that tries to kind of mold people's sense of what's real in order to better control them, right? And so that's something I think that thinkers within the gender paradigm rightly recognize, that power of language. Now, what's different is that I would argue that yes, language can shape our perception of reality, but reality still exists, right? Reality
hmm.
pushes back. Okay, so there is something that's real behind the kind of social, and so language then should serve a function that discloses what's real rather than trying to distort or shape what's real, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I thought you did that really well in your book. For example, when you talk about intersectionality, you take some issues with it, but say, all right, what can we learn from this? What does this get right? Why would people believe this? And I love that because that's how I tend to approach issues too. Look for common ground, even though at its core, there's some big differences between these two paradigms. I love that. Now, you mentioned a little bit at the Genesis account, so maybe we'll come back to this. But one of the figures who is consistently mentioned in these circles is Judith Butler. And she talks about how sexual identity or sexed identity is only a performance.
Mhm.
Who was she? Why was she so significant? And what does she mean by this?
Sure. So yeah, it's hard. I don't think it's possible to overestimate her influence in
Hmm.
especially the academy. So, I mean, gender studies as a discipline is basically applied Judith Butler. It just takes her theories and then tries to kind of apply them. So Judith Butler, she's a philosopher. She's still alive, still active
Hmm.
at Berkeley, I believe. And her work on gender is her most prominent works on gender started in the 90s, really the late 80s, 90s. And so the way she reshapes the conversation is that she makes the claim that not only is gender a social construct, but sex itself is socially constructed. So before
Hmm.
Judith Butler, second wave feminists already had this idea of gender as the cultural expressions or norms attached to biological sex. So that was kind of the classic sex gender split in feminist thought. Well, with Butler, she ups the ante, right? So she
Hmm.
says that okay, gender is a social construct, yes, but so is sex. So basically, what she's doing is she's collapsing everything into gender. And she's saying that anything we think is true or natural or real about men and women, maleness and femaleness, is something that's created by us. It's a social fiction rather than a fact that you can observe in the world. And so her idea of gender as a performance, basically, she's arguing that all of us, as soon as we're born, we're like ushered into these social scripts that tell us what it means to be a girl, what it means to be a boy.
Mm,
And we internalize those scripts, and then we're constantly, unconsciously performing them. And that performance creates the illusion that there's something real behind my performance, that my performance of being a woman creates the illusion that being a woman is a real thing, in other words.
mm.
So she's saying something really radical. She's not just saying that we perform certain norms or we display our gender in a performative way. She's actually saying that gender or womanness, manness isn't real, but it is this compelled, socially compelled act of performance.
Okay, so this is radical, and you can see this in so much thought today, that she's not denying that there's a sexual binary. I mean, that's as obvious as anything can be, as I understand it. But as soon as as I understand her beliefs, I didn't mean as I understand the sexual
No,
binary.
sure, sure.
Uh, but as soon as we start saying what this means, that's where it's all subjective and it's a matter of gender and we're performing something. So there's a physical reality, but that carries no meaning with it whatsoever. All of that meaning is artificial from society. Did I get that right?
I think you got that almost right. Although the reason I
Okay.
laughed when you said, she would acknowledge the sex binary is that I don't think that she would. So I
Really?
think that, yeah,
Okay.
I think basically what she's arguing is that we've chosen to categorize human beings according to these clusters of physical characteristics, and that is sort of an arbitrary choice. You might
Mm,
say like, well, why not categorize people according to hair color, or why not categorize people according to, I don't know, like ratio of like head sizes or something. I don't know.
sure.
So I think she's really saying that just even the categorization of sex as a binary is not a natural feature of the world. I mean, essentially nothing is natural in Butler's philosophy. But yeah, even the category of the sex binary, I think she would reject. And so that's one way in which her work is so influenced, because it's the prelude to the very common idea now that sex is a spectrum, right? We wouldn't be
Mm.
able to have that idea be so widespread and so successful if it weren't, I think, for Judith Butler kind of paving the way with her influential theories in the academy.
Okay, so what do you think she got right? And why do you think this lands with some people? Because it feels so obviously not true to me from the paradigm in which I stand. What did she get right? And why was this even received and entertained, so to speak?
Yeah, I think how I struggle with Butler is it just the fact of human reproduction seems so obvious to me that, well, of course we categorize people according to these specific differences, because only
Mm,
these specific differences are capable of bringing a new human being into existence, right? That seems to make it important. Like differences in hair color, don't have that kind of power.
mm.
um, so I would say that's her major weakness, I think, is downplaying just the fact, the brute fact, the very reason we all exist, which is that we're a sexually reproducing species. Um, so I think that what Butler has right, I think she is getting on something, that there is something performative about gender, right?
Hmm.
And this is one reason why when I've taught Butler in the past, students often really like her ideas, because we live in a very performative culture, and it's getting more and more so all the time, especially the more we're
Hmm.
online, right? So we're constantly performing our identity. And so I think it seems very intuitively true that when Judith Butler says that gender is a performance, college students are like, oh, totally, I'm performing my gender all the time. But I think they often don't realize quite the extreme point that she's making.
How far she goes. So, in
Right.
some ways, it seems like at stake here is in the Christian worldview, we believe there's an objective truth embedded into the world, and we read that truth out of nature. of course, Romans 1 or Psalms 19, the skies declare the glory of God. The heavens, proclaim his majesty. There's a truth embedded outside of us that we recognize and conform our lives to. Seems like this paradigm is completely shifting that on its head and saying there is no objective truth built into the world. We really define and come up with things arbitrarily. That's at the heart of one of the differences between the gender paradigm and a Christian worldview. Would you agree?
Yes. Yeah, I think
Mm.
so. And that reversal. I mean, it's not just the Christian tradition that has that view of reality and human knowledge, right? You even see that in Aristotle. Okay, this idea that
Mm.
that the world is intelligible to us, and human beings by nature desire to know that world, and we are equipped to know it. Right? We are equipped to seek knowledge and to find it. And one of the reversals that's happened, which is not unique to the gender paradigm, but I think a trend in Western modern philosophy in general, is the kind of the reversal of where meaning is found. So rather than
Mm.
there's meaning that exists in the world that I can then bring my kind of faculties to access, rather meaning exists in me and I project it onto the world. Right. So that's a big reversal that's happening.
And that's really what C.S. Lewis was talking about in The Abolition of Man, 70 years ago with the Tao. There's this larger religious tradition of objective truth we discover. That's being flipped on its head here. Now, let's just ask this question straightforward then, because there's been a lot of discussion about this, including shows about what it actually even means to be a woman. So what is the definition of a woman?
Sure. So a woman is the kind of human being whose body is organized according to the potential to gestate life. We're mammals, right? So
Mm-hmm.
mammalian females, we gestate and we lactate. So that's the definition that I use, and I think it's a pretty darn good one, I will admit, and that's because of the if I do say so
I
myself.
like your
Um,
confidence.
well, I've been thinking about this for a long time. So, and I think it's because of the word potential, right? So
Mm.
I think most people have an intuitive sense about what it means to be a woman, but then when we try to define it, it's sometimes hard to respond to objections like, well, what about someone who's had a hysterectomy? Or what about infertile woman? Or what about a prepubescent girl, right? So what's the definition that could speak to all of those different kinds of females? But first of all, I would say, well, even that objection presumes the category of woman, right?
Mm.
Even as it's like, well, what about this kind of woman and this kind of
Mm.
woman, right? So but potential, I think, is important because even like as a female, as a woman, my entire physical body is organized, structured according to a particular procreative potential. Now, even if I never actualize that potential, it's existed the whole time I've existed, right? So it
Mm.
existed pre-puberty. There, I still had that potential. It still formed kind of the structure of my bodily life. That's the body plan, the body map that I have. And at some point, and this has happened in my case, I have had my own children, so that potential has been actualized. But even if it never were, that wouldn't at all change the reality that I have that innate potential to begin with.
Mm.
So even the category infertility, because this is a common objection, but even the category of infertility points to some kind of underlying potential that's not being actualized for some reason, right? That's why infertility has different definitions depending upon whether you're male or female, right? So
Mm.
a male who can't get pregnant is not then considered infertile, right? Because that's not an
Mm.
innate potential that he had to begin with.
Mm.
So I think that's a good basic underlying definition for what it means to be a woman.
Okay, say it one more time.
So a woman is the kind of human being whose body is organized according to the potential to gestate new life. Or
So by
you could
that,
say, yeah, you could say the potential to produce large gametes and gestate new life. You could get kind of
sure.
specific, but I think it's also important. So in a lot of the rhetoric about sex right now, it's sex is often talked about as if it just refers to body parts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rather than the organization of the body as a whole. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about like a structural, a determining structural category, really, here. So it's not just about discrete body parts, but it's about the organization of the body.
So then by that definition, somebody could not change from a man to a woman, period, because it's the organization of the entire body, not body parts, right?
Yes, and also, at least at this time in human history, it's not possible to endow that innate potential onto a body that doesn't have it. So you
Mm,
can change the appearance of certain sexual characteristics, but you can't give the generative potential to a body that doesn't have it. Now, I don't know if we were to go into like sci-fi
okay.
hypothetical land, you know, like if
Sure.
it were
Sure.
possible. I actually had an argument with a Dominican priest the other day about this, and I was like, no, it's not possible. And he's like, but what if? And I thought, okay, well, maybe if we're going to be in like Star Trek land, then it might be possible. But
It's logically possible. The question is it metaphysically possible? Certainly not right now. We can land
yeah,
there. So then at the moment of conception, you could have an embryo that is a woman because its body is organized in a way that has the potential in the way that you described, right? Manness or womanness exists at conception. It's just not expressed fully until different stages. Would you agree with that?
yeah, that's actually a really interesting question. So I wouldn't say woman because woman does mean adulthood, but you could say
Right.
female, right? But it's true that that the sexual differentiation. So in other words, you have like an embryo will have the genetic recipe for a
Mm-hmm.
particular sexual development pathway, but there are cases where that genetic recipe might be disrupted because of environmental factors, which could then shift the developmental pathway, right? So, for example,
Mm.
let's say you have an embryo with XY chromosomes, right? So there you have the development pathway of male, um, but then let's say there's some kind of like the SRY gene on the Y chromosome fails to launch basically. Well, then if that gene isn't activated or that particular gene isn't activated, then the fetus will develop female. That's kind of it's almost like the
Mm.
default development pathway is female. You have to kind of flip a switch and then it becomes male, right? So chromosomes have that switch encoded, but then
Okay.
sometimes there might be something that goes wrong that makes that switch not flip. So, but by the time you have like a, a fully formed human body, you know, even in these cases of um, disorders of sexual development, most of the time they don't result in any kind of sexual ambiguity. It might just be an atypical morphology of some
Mm.
kind.
Mm.
But even in cases where, let's say, you have a baby who's born sexually ambiguous, well, then you need a team of specialists to, again, look at the organism as a whole. And then in almost every case, even if you have to wait a little bit longer, like through puberty to see what the body does, you will still see one sex or the other predominate, right? So there's never been a recorded instance of a hermaphroditic human being.
Mm.
So a human being capable of fulfilling both procreative niches, if that
Mm.
makes sense, right? So even in these super complex cases, um, male, human beings are male or female, right? We tend into those different pathways. Yeah. And
Yeah,
again,
that
yeah, even if yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say that's helpful. In these cases that are rare exceptions, still obviously valuable human beings, doesn't overturn the typical development of human beings from conception forward. They're just difficult exceptions we need to work with and use wisdom through, I think is the heart of it. Why do you think our culture has such a hard time with the definition of a woman? I mean, I just saw an article this morning that was talking about how common sense has gone out. I mean, 5 or 10 years ago, it was so obvious. If we were having this conversation about what is a man or what is a woman, people would have thought like, what has happened? And yet now it's just been completely overturned where something that seems about as obvious as anything, at least to me, is being questioned. So why does our culture have such a hard time with this definition?
Hmm. Well, I think that's a huge question, and
Mm.
in a large part, the book, The Genesis of Gender, is an attempt to kind of make sense of that and to tell that story. And so one of the big threads I trace in the book is the one we've been talking about, which is the development of the concept of gender itself, right? And especially the movement away from the idea that the sex binary exists and is real, right? So to put it simply, this concept of gender has eclipsed the idea of sex in our culture. So there's been
Hmm.
a conceptual revolution. Another piece of the story, I think, is a technological revolution. So one of the other threads I trace in the book is, I guess you could call it the contraceptual revolution. And
Mm.
I make the argument in the book that the technology of contraception, I think, and its widespread embrace in our culture has shifted how we think about what it means to be a woman and what we think about what it means to be a man. So our cultural imagination has shifted. So no longer is it about, again, the potential for motherhood or the potential for fatherhood. It's about how one looks. It's about the roles one performs in society.
Mm.
Increasingly, I think it's really about appearance. So it becomes about these externalities, right? It doesn't become about that innate potential that we were talking about earlier. So I think that's also a big piece. And then maybe if I were to name like a third prevailing cause, and this is something I didn't go into as much detail in the book as I now would if I were writing it,
Huh.
but I would say the influence of social media specifically.
Ah.
And I would say specifically Tumblr, especially in its zenith, which would have been maybe 2011 to, let's say, 2015 or so. So I think one of the big factors that's happened is that these kind of niche, weird ideas about gender that have been percolating in the academy in the early 2000s, especially in that second decade in the 2000s when social media was first appearing on the scene, and you had, especially on Tumblr, interactions between like teenagers and adults, and it was very unmoderated, a lot of adult content on that particular forum. So then you have these kind of niche academic ideas about sex and gender trickling down into Tumblr, and then on Tumblr it basically becomes this incubator and for all these really niche ideas about gender. So the idea like non-binary or demisexual or bigender, agender, all these categories and almost like tags, like blogging tags about sexuality and gender just go crazy. They go wild on Tumblr,
Yeah.
right? But then around 2014 or so, they hit mainstream. Like I bet you can remember when Facebook announced a new list of genders or whatever, when
Yep.
all of a sudden there were like 23 genders on
Hmm.
Facebook. Everyone was like, wait, what? Well, that all those 23 genders or whatever they were, those are Tumblr genders. So then we have this weird niche culture on Tumblr, which is really kind of dominated by a lot of teenage girls.
Mm.
It kind of becomes mainstream. And then there's this trickle up effect of Tumblr and social media, I think. I mean, it's funny to think now that the discipline of gender studies is maybe even more shaped by the imaginations of teenage girls on Tumblr than by Judith Butler's theories, right? It's this bizarre
Wow.
kind of like alliance of those
That
two.
is interesting.
Yeah. And now it's mainstream, right? It's not just on Tumblr anymore. No one's really on Tumblr anymore. Now it's in the institutions, it's on major social media platforms, it's in the New York Times, it's in every HR department,
Mm.
right? So, um, yeah, so those concepts, even words like the idea of preferred pronouns, right? That didn't come from the academy. Um, even terms like misgendering someone, right? Those were kind of born on social media, or at least
Mm.
disseminated on social media, right? Rather than through the academy. So I think that's also a huge factor in what we're seeing.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, social media blurs lines between public and private, between work and home, between real and fake. In fact, on social media, we're not embodied, really. We're just souls. And so, how we think, we get to define our own reality and aren't limited by a physical reality. it just plays into this Gnostic kind of worldview that undermines so much of the gender paradigm. So when you do an update, I would definitely encourage you to include that. That makes a lot of sense. So let's take a step back. If we were to talk about what it means to be a healthy woman, maybe compare and contrast for us what, say, a Christian or broadly just kind of Western idea of what it means to be healthy with what it would mean to be healthy according to the gender paradigm.
Ooh, that's a good question. Right. So health, I think we're witnessing a huge paradigm shift when we're coming to what health means, especially in the medical world. So traditionally, not just in the Christian tradition, but I would just say in Western tradition, medical tradition, um, all medical traditions, not just Western. Health is about the wholeness of the body. So the
Mm-hmm.
entire organism functioning as it should. I mean, health and wholeness etymologically
Mm-hmm.
are connected in terms of just what the words even mean. Um, so, in other words, there's this objectivity to what, for example, a healthy body looks like. Um, are the parts doing the jobs they're designed to do, right? And if not, is there a way we can support the correction of that disorder that's happening in the body? Can we restore the order and the wholeness of the body? But now, especially in gender medicine, the idea of health is much more about a subjective sense of satisfaction than it
Mm.
is about an objective functioning or right ordering of the organism. And this is really explicit when it comes to the way that transition is talked about, because what medical transition does is it intervenes in the endocrine system and the reproductive system, and it intentionally disrupts those systems so that they malfunction
Mm.
in order to create a desired effect of cosmetic change or a change in appearance, right? So that's the desired effect. And then the assumption is that that change in appearance will create a sense of well-being or a better
Mm-hmm.
psychological state,
Mm-hmm.
which I is often used. The word that's most often used that I see in the literature is satisfaction, right? Just so
Mm.
a sense of satisfaction, um, even though there's all kinds of downstream physical effects that are happening, right? Because our bodies are complicated and our systems are interrelated. So if you begin kind of, you know, playing around with one system, have it malfunction, it's going to affect other things. And so there are physical costs to
Mm-hmm.
medical transition, but because health is seen as this sense of satisfaction and also this alleviation of any kind of subjective sense of distress, that vision of health overrides any kind of objective sense of the body itself being healthy.
That's really helpful. And that makes sense from where I see, not as poured into the literature as you are. But it would also invite a follow up question that if in the gender realm, it's about satisfaction and we don't change the soul, so to speak, to match the body, in many cases, let's adapt the body so I have greater satisfaction in my soul. Why wouldn't we do that with, say, anorexia or bulimia, where it's the opposite? It's no, no, no. We got to help your thinking match up with your body rather than say it's about satisfaction. Let's approach this and adopt your faulty beliefs about how your physical state is. So, why the disconnect there?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mean, I think it's because of the widespread confusion about sex and gender, because all
Hmm.
the conceptual changes that we've been talking about, that gives a sense of legitimacy, I think, to the idea
Mm.
that gender isn't really in the body; it's more in the mind. Um, and so I think there's something that seems more maybe intuitively true about it than would have before these conceptual revolutions. And to, hit on the contraception point again, I think it's, and I make this case in the book too, because the technology of using cross-sex hormones change the appearance of sex characteristics is the exact same technology that's used in the birth control pill to disrupt a woman's reproductive system and make her temporarily sterile. And these technologies were developed at in the same decade, right? And they have behind them the same, I would say, misguided notion of health, right? Because the birth control pill has that same idea that we're intervening not to correct a physiological problem, but actually to create a physiological problem
Mm-hmm.
in order then to have some other kind of effect for a different purpose. And so I think
Mm.
we're so used to, as a culture, hormones specifically being used that way, right? I mean, so that's one reason why I speculate that maybe one of the reasons people aren't as freaked out about dosing young children with hormones is that we've been doing it to our daughters for decades already, right? So I think that's one piece of it. Um, Not to sound like a crazy Catholic, but
No, no, no,
there
no. That's
there
fair.
there are people who are not Catholic who are also making similar arguments about how that use of technology, of medical technology, has shifted things. Um, yeah.
Well, I think, look, I think probably most Protestants would agree with that. Maybe not to the level, but I think that's a very fair point that
Right.
everybody needs to take into consideration, and is a fascinating part of your book. Now, I have obviously not read near as much as you have on queer theory or gender theory, but I've read some, and so many of the accounts that I read are individuals who start out and didn't fit in kind of a certain gender paradigm. And Christianity felt like it was forcing them into Procrustean bed, and it just felt like maybe I don't fit the stereotype of a man or a woman. Maybe I don't want to eat meat and ride four-wheelers and watch football. Maybe I want to do worship and art or something like that, just to take these stereotypes. And then people find some of this gender paradigm and describe it as very just empowering.
Mhm.
Wow, now somebody gets me. So I'm partly curious, if do you see that experience? Is that common, that there's just a lot of people who went through this and didn't feel understood in the cultural stereotypes or the church stereotype, and so this gender paradigm was really liberating to them?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. So I guess,
Hmm.
one of the pieces, of the gender paradigm that I might point to as saying something true is that I think in our culture, the the prominent scripts that we have about manhood and womanhood are impoverished in some ways, and they're too
Hmm.
narrow, right?
Hmm.
Um, so there is something about the need to, I guess, normalize the fact that there is quite a lot of variation within femaleness and within maleness in terms of personality traits, in terms of likes, in terms of dislikes, and that we can talk about male typical and female typical behavior and traits, but typical or average, I mean, the very concept of that means that there are people who aren't typical and aren't average by definition, right? And that those people shouldn't be made to feel as though they're any less of a woman or less of a
Hmm.
man. But one of my critiques of the gender paradigm is that it ironically kind of affirms that idea because I think with the Judith Butler heyday in the 90s, where it was much more about gender fluid, gender queer, this wasn't happening. But in our time, where we're transitioning gender nonconforming children to embrace the idea of, or the identity of the opposite sex, that actually seems to reinscribe these stereotypes that we're talking about, right? So,
Hmm.
because now we're invited to question whether the gender nonconforming boy is really a boy, right?
Hmm.
I've been reading this book that just came out called Time to Think, and it's a BBC journalist writing an expose basically of the scandal that's unfolding there, related to gender medicine for youth. And when one of the stories she tells, like that, one of the people she interviews, I was just reading this earlier today, describes like, well, I just wasn't a typical boy. I didn't like sports and I didn't like this, and so I figured I
Hmm.
must not be a boy, right? So again, there's this move toward defining girlhood and boyhood according to these externalities because we're so kind of distanced from the meaning of sex.
Hmm.
And now it's just about these external things.
I think that's really helpful. When I look at the church, one of the things I'll do in my presentations is I'll say to audiences, primarily Christian, I'll say, give me an example of somebody who's a manly man. And the first two examples are always David and Samson. I'll say, well, when was David acting like a man? When he cut off Goliath's head. And then I'll say, well, what about when David wrote poetry? What about when he played a harp? David was a man, and the Bible doesn't indicate he was acting in his maleness here, in his femaleness there. He was somebody who did both. Now, I think one time, Abigail, I've probably done this a few dozen times, has somebody shouted out Jesus.
Oh my gosh, wow.
We don't think of Jesus as a manly man. We don't. Now, clearly, he comes with a sword in his mouth, and Revelation is going to judge. That might fit our stereotypes. But Jesus also wept over Jerusalem. He wept over the death of Lazarus. You know, one of the worst lies is that real men don't cry. I mean, these stereotypes are just painful. Then I'll talk about Jacob and Esau. I'll say, okay, who's more manly? And it's like, well, Esau's a hairy hunter. I mean, he just fits the stereotype. Jacob's a homeboy, but God, a mama's boy, I guess would be the stereotype to choose. But God chooses Jacob, interestingly enough, and never makes that distinction. So when I read some of the queer theory, I feel like, gosh, so often are they diagnosing some of the right problems that we've made these stereotypes into what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, but they just bring in this postmodern idea and completely go off the rails and offer the wrong solution. So my critique is sometimes if we just would listen more and say, why is this worldview appealing to people? What did they get right? Why are people attracted to this moment that feels so obviously false? If we'd at least start there, I think we'd have more compassion and understanding and probably be able to persuade people of a biblical worldview and the goodness it offers if we just take the time to understand first.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I'll even up the ante a little bit and say
Okay?
that I see so many of the desires behind, especially the desire for transition, seem to me these deeply Christian desires that are twisted toward
Mm,
the wrong end or the wrong solution, right? So
mm.
the desire for conversion, right? The desire to become who I
Wow.
really am, the
Mm,
desire to put on the new man, right? That desire for
wow.
transformation, for whole self transformation is so powerful. The desire for belonging to a community, the desire for, I mean, in Catholic theology and sacramental theology, we talk about the body serving this sacramental function. So the body
Mm,
reveals the person, the body makes present the inner life, the interior life of the spirit. And so I see in stories of transition as well, this desire for the body to speak the truth of a person. And again, that desire is deeply a desire for something good. But the
mm,
problem is that in this paradigm, the desires are this paradigm tries to meet those desires with a in a purely technological and temporal way. But those desires are can only be filled by they're infinite desires. They can only be filled by something infinite that embraces our full nature um, and perfects it through grace, right? So the desires are good, but they're twisted toward things that can't fulfill them.
I love the way you up the ante on that. I hadn't even thought of conversion in that sense. Now it feels so obvious. And the new man and this recognition that we're broken and yearning to be made whole, those are deep Christian ideas. But you're right, the problem is not technological, it's relational and it's
Mhm.
spiritual at its whole, which is to not downplay the body. That's a part of who we are, but that's the root of the issue. So let's get practical with a few questions. I'm curious how you would navigate. How about doctors and parents? how you think they should respond when kids express gender dysphoria or are considering transition.
Okay, so doctors, I think if I were to direct any righteous anger toward anyone in this in this debacle, it would be toward doctors who have
Mm,
embraced gender affirming care. But on the one hand, it's not entirely their fault, because one of the things that's happened is that the major medical associations in the United States have essentially been kind of captured by
mm,
the gender paradigm, if you want to put it that way. And what's fascinating is that just recently there was an article in the British Medical Journal that showed that all the recommendations of the Endocrine Society, the APA, and even WPATH don't meet the criteria for being evidence based, right?
mm,
But they're, in other words, they're providing, but their recommendations and their standards of care are providing cover for physicians who are using these practices, right? Because then a doctor can point and say, I was just following the standards of care, right? Even though
mm-hmm.
the evidence itself behind those standards of care is very low quality. So I would say to doctors, do your own research. Actually look directly at the evidence base. Don't just look at standards of care. I've spent the past couple of months reading every study on gender
Wow.
medical transition for youth, because I don't want to be an ideologue about this. I really want to know what I'm talking about. And it's really the evidence base is really poor. And
Mm.
every country that's actually done a systematic review of the evidence base has changed their protocols. So Sweden,
Wow.
Finland, most recently Norway, UK is doing this, France. Norway, I think, was just last week. So I would say yes, if you're a doctor and you haven't done your own careful reading into the evidence base, then I wouldn't do anything before really becoming
Mm.
informed. And then, meditate on the Hippocratic Oath for a while about not harming
Wow.
people. So, parents, I would say follow your instincts on this, because one of the things that I think is happening quite frequently, especially with young people, is that you have an adolescent who gets super online. They're on, binging YouTube trans influencer videos. They're on TikTok, right? So they're being fed this narrative that the reason you're unhappy, the reason you feel alone, the reason you're not at home in your
Mm-hmm.
body is because you're trans. So they're just like, diving deep into that. And then you have enabling them, these doctors and clinicians that are telling the parents, yes, your kid is trans, you need to transition them. So I would say, parents, do your research,
Mm.
right? Actually look at the evidence base. Don't, investigate the claims. So for example, the claim that transition, it's either a suicide or transition, that is not an
Mm.
evidence-based claim. So make sure you do your reading on that. And I would say, lovingly hold your boundaries. So
Mm.
focus on the relationship, like really shoring up the relationship with your kid. Um, really ask them what's going on and try to hear where they are in their heart.
Mm.
Um, Communicate your love and your support for them, and that nothing they do will change that love for them. But at the same time, I would hold boundaries and communicate them and say, as long as I'm your parent, like here's where here's a line I'm gonna draw. Um, but within those boundaries, like, I'm with you. And so I do think it's really important for adults in positions of responsibility
Mm.
to be acting as adults here.
That's great. So your book, The Genesis of Gender, has a lot of research, but any other websites or updates when you say doctors or parents should do your research that you trust, where they could just get some articles and dive into this themselves?
Yeah, so I would actually, a great place to start would be, and an unbiased, very unbiased place to start would be this article in the British Medical Journal. It just came out on the debate about gender medicine. So I bet if you just Googled British Medical Journal gender, it'll come up. It just came out this month or maybe last month. Another website is the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, or SEGM,
Mm.
SEGM.org. That's a good one. I actually am just finishing up edits on about like a 20-page guide on gender affirming care and gender identity theory. It's co-written with a pediatric endocrinologist, and that will be
Mm.
available on the McGrath Institute website soon. So I will definitely share that on my social media when it's ready, because I think that also is a pretty good distillation of the evidence. So there's a couple of places to start.
Yeah, that's great. That definitely can get us going for a little bit. Super helpful. Would you use a preferred pronoun for somebody who is transgender? And what would you suggest for others who are kind of caught between what sometimes is speaking truth or being compassionate?
Yeah, this is a really hard question, and it's one that I am still thinking
Hmm.
about, and I have never felt completely settled on. And I didn't feel settled on it even when I wrote the book, right?
Hmm.
Because on the one hand, I think because of my in-depth knowledge of gender theory, I'm only too aware how much of the gender paradigm is linguistic, like how much of its power is behind the manipulation of language. Like I'm so very aware of that. And I don't think that that's good. On the other hand, I also am so very aware of the fact that I don't think that trans people should be ostracized from their churches,
Mm.
from their families, from their
Mm.
communities. And I think it's so important to be able to meet a person where he or she is, and to establish a relationship of trust and mutual respect before any kind of meaningful accompaniment or evangelization can happen. So I feel genuinely like caught between those two
Mm.
things. So here's how I'm thinking about it right now. I think that um, it's important to discern, to use careful and prudential judgment and discernment in figuring out when to use someone's preferred pronouns. I would say probably by default, right now I'm leaning toward, you know, discerning when to use them rather than discerning when not to use them, if that makes sense. So the
Mm.
default is to try to
Sure.
use reality-based language. And I think anytime we're crafting law or policy, absolutely, it should be reality-based language. But in the interpersonal, that's a little more difficult. So when you're trying to discern whether to use preferred pronouns in a relational context, I think you should think about your role and responsibility toward the person. So a parent of a minor child has a particular
Mm.
responsibility and role there. A pastor has a particular responsibility, a professor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas just a neighbor or adult
Mm.
siblings or a friend, right? So there are some relationships that are vertical, there are some that are horizontal, and so I think that changes. That's at least a factor to think about. And I think anytime that preferred pronouns are used, it needs to be for a specific, again, like relational goal, not just because you want to make yourself feel better in the moment, if that makes sense, which is, I really relate to that for sure. But I do think it's possible for it not to be a lie. That's something I've been thinking about, because I do think that if I were to use someone's preferred pronouns, um, basically the way I would think about it is that I'm adopting a social convention
Mm-hmm.
where, um, pronoun use is connected to someone's um, kind of chosen gender identity, right? So I'm I'm not like assenting to some broader worldview necessarily, right? And I think especially if that use of preferred pronoun is paired with an honesty about the disagreement with that worldview, then I think that shows. I think that makes clear that by using this pronoun, I'm not like agreeing, like I'm
Hmm.
not signing my name to everything here, but this is like a gesture of hospitality, right? So anyway, I think it's complicated. I will say, I don't think it's like a moral absolute.
Mm.
I do think it's a question where there's um, times to use prudential judgment. I will say the younger someone is, the more caution that should be held. So
That
it's
makes
hard for
sense.
me to imagine with an adolescent or a young child ever thinking that's a good idea. Um, but yeah, when it comes to an adult who transitioned 10 years ago, who you just met at the dog park, like, just get to know that person. And most of the time in interpersonal interactions, you don't use anyone's pronouns anyway.
Yeah, that's right.
But one interesting pastoral point though, because most of the time I just kind of avoid pronouns, especially when I'm directly talking to someone. But I was speaking with a priest who was like, that's always what I did. But then one time I was meeting with a transgender person for spiritual direction. And at the end, I was praying for this person. And now I'm
Mm.
talking to God, right? So when you're talking to God and praying for someone, you use pronouns, right? I'm going to say, like, dear God, bless Sean, help him know that he's loved by you, right? Like, avoiding pronouns would be very
Be
awkward and
awkward.
very obvious in that
Yeah.
moment, right? So I thought that was a really good point. Like, okay, this
Mm.
is something that you need to think through really carefully so you're kind of prepared for moments like that.
I super appreciate your thoughtfulness on this. I've encouraged people that if somebody says, hey, would you use my preferred pronoun? If you can, simply say, hey, that's a really important thing you're asking me to do. Would you be willing to just, when you have time, grab some coffee and tell me about that? Tell me your story. Tell me when you have these feelings. My whole goal is simply to understand where you're coming from and why this is so important to you, and really try to understand and listen. At the end, say, hey, do you feel like I've understood you? If they say yes, great. Say, are you open to hearing how I see the world and gender so we can understand each other? Now, anywhere along the way, somebody can say no, but this feels like such a gracious, understand first goal. And then at the end, I hold a similar view that you do, that I lean strongly towards reality language, except possibly in a few exceptions
Mm-hmm.
I'm open
Yeah.
to, not absolute. And then at the end, just I'm committed to this relationship. Is there a way that you can feel respected? And I can just feel that I'm being authentic to myself and not violating my conscience. What would this look like for us? And if you decide to use the pronouns, like you said, then it's very clear why. They understand where you're coming from. It's a
Exactly.
gesture of
Yeah.
kindness. It doesn't always work out that clean, but I'd love to see Christians try to be that kind of hospitable and thoughtful and gracious how we approach others,
Yeah.
is the way that I look at it. Good stuff. Now, I've got a ton more questions for you, but we're gonna have to probably wrap up here with one last question. Are you comfortable using gender and sex terminology? And what I mean by this is Christopher Wright, who I know you've read. I've read a ton of his stuff. So Valium is a Catholic writer in theology of the body. He made this point where the word gender has the root gen, Gen, from
Mm-hmm.
generate, genetics, genesis, generation, which means to produce or beget. So gender is tied to how you produce with your biological sex. That's classically how it's been understood, and that makes sense even built within the word. I don't have a problem using the term gender and sex because one seems to refer to biology, and Judith Butler and others seem to be right to a degree that there are some culturally bound practices and performances that gender does capture. So I don't mind using gender and sex language. My concern is when they get totally divorced and now the sex body is irrelevant to one's gender. Have we given away too much by even using that language? Or what would your thoughts be?
This is also a question I'm actively thinking through.
Good.
I'm writing a paper now that I'm presenting at a conference in May called "Is Gender Too Troubled?" Basically, it's this
Okay.
very idea, like, should we use this word? So I think, again, it depends on the context, but anytime you're having a discussion with someone about gender, you need to define terms. Like, especially if they're
Mm.
making a claim about gender, make sure you say, okay, well, can you define what you mean by gender, right? And so then in different contexts, if I'm if I'm meaning gender in a particular way, I will clarify. For a long time, especially after writing this book, I was like, I'm just going to try not to use this word. But it's really hard. It's really hard not to use it because sex also has this other meaning that you
Mm-hmm.
often don't necessarily want to flag in a particular conversation. um, that people immediately think as soon as you say the word sex, they don't think about maleness and femaleness, they think about something else. So that's difficult. I think that from a Christian perspective, if we're going to use the term gender, it should always be in reference to a whole person, right?
Hmm.
Not to a part of a person. But if
Huh.
we think about like, I don't know, like an SAT analogy where female is to sex as woman is to gender, right? Then gender
Hmm.
includes sex, like just as woman includes female, but it also includes the fact that being a woman, I'm an historical time-bound being in a particular cultural context. I also am a psychological and spiritual being, right? So it refers to my whole person. But it has that generative root, like you mentioned. I think that's using that term in that way. So almost like reconflating gender and sex, even though that goes against my feminist education. But I really do think, even though the sex gender distinction makes sense when we're talking about gender as these cultural norms, I I honestly think that that distinction, that pulling those words apart, has paved the way for this drastic
Hmm.
separation. Because we can still
Hmm.
talk about, like, gendered norms, or
Sure.
gendered, cultural gender norms, or things like that, right? Without jumping on the bandwagon that gender is entirely a social construct. But I think gender has to be connected to sex again. Um, that's the problem
Hmm.
that we've run into.
Amen to that. I've got so many more questions for you, Abigail. I really appreciate your voice on this,
Mhm.
just the way you approach it, the spirit in your book. Again, for viewers, The Genesis of Gender by Abigail Favale is just excellent. Even if you're not a Christian and you're watching this and you say, I want to understand a thoughtful Christian approach to gender, I think you'll feel like she has done her homework and made a great case here. Hope you'll pick it up. Abigail, let's do it again. But before people click away, I want to encourage them, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other shows coming up on near-death experiences. We're going to always talk about the reliability of Scripture. We have evidence coming up with Gary Habermas soon for evidence for Jesus outside of the Bible. Make sure you hit subscribe. And if you thought about studying apologetics at a distance, we'd love to have you at Biola. I'm actually teaching a whole class in the fall on sex and gender for our grad students. So there's information below. We'd love to have you in our master's program. Abigail, you're a rock star. This has really been a lot of fun. Thanks for taking so much time to hang with me. And tell your dad that my dad said hi.
I will. Thank you so much.